Welcome to Lumient Live. I'm your host, Mark Ackroyd. Lumient Live is the podcast for advice professionals that believe in a values-based advice experience, but still have that question, how does it all work? We connect listeners with other advice professionals to hear best practice client stories or business examples and lift the lid on how they made it happen. Now, on to today's episode.
Before we begin today's episode with Xander Hawes, you might notice that as we discuss these client examples that Xander's brought in, there's a few blank spots within the recording. That's because, to protect the client privacy, we've just blanked out their names. With that, enjoy today's episode.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Lumient Live. I am joined by another really exciting guest today, Xander Hawes from Invest Blue in Brisbane. G'day, Xander. How are you, man?
Good, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for jumping on today. I'm really excited for this episode because it's going to touch on a bit of a different sort of use case and scenario that we've maybe championed in the past. So before we get into too much of that detail, though, how about we tell the audience a little bit about who the heck you are, Xander, because we've been working together for a little bit now in our pilot with Invest Blue and as we roll that out. But tell us a little bit about your career and how you've got to where you've got to today so that everyone can sort of understand a bit about you.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I started off actually in engineering. So I was doing fly in, fly out work. And after doing that for as long as I possibly could, I thought there's got to be another way. And I've always had a love for numbers and I guess dealing with clients. So I thought, you know what, financial planning would suit me really well. So I said goodbye to engineering and flew to London and did my master's in finance and investing over there. And then came back and I guess really hit the ground running and fell in love with financial planning. So the numbers skill set works well in financial planning. We deal with a lot of numbers and also the ability to see clients, help them and be on that journey with them. So I've been doing financial planning since I've been back, I guess, 2016. So what's that, almost 7 years, and 3 of which is with Invest Blue.
Right. Well, it's that's awesome, man. How is that transition from engineering and FIFO into finance and then in particular doing it over in England?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of an uneasy change of events, but sometimes in life when you don't want to remain too comfortable, and I thought, engineering, I could keep doing it, but wasn't really enjoying it. FIFO, for anyone that does it, it's a bit of a grind to say the least, especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere for long periods of time. So I took a bit of a risk. 4 years of engineering, spent a lot of money to get that piece of paper to then turn my back on it. So it was a bit of a risk, but I haven't looked back ever since. That's the main thing.
No, that is good. Living your best possible life, as Invest Blue would say. I must take this time just to clarify. There is a ton of words that I use since I've moved over here in the States that I have to always circle back on and just make sure people check and can understand. The term FIFO for our US audience, if you haven't heard of it, stands for fly in, fly out work. Am I right there, Xander? I mean, look at me. I'm not the manual labor sort of kind of guy. So I only know this from friends that have done it. But it's where typically you fly in for an extended period of time, work on site. Was it mining, Xander, that you were working in?
Yeah, plenty of remote locations in central Queensland. So sort of 2 hours out of Brisbane, there's nothing. And I was sort of 7 or 8 hours out of Brisbane where there's really nothing.
Yeah. As you put it, right, really tricky sort of life, but one that is fruitful for a lot of people. So, mate, great to have you transition from there into financial planning. Tell us a bit about your time at Invest Blue. You said you've been there for 3 years.
Yeah, it's funny how I got into Invest Blue. So I used to work with Tim Jones, who's one of the senior planners at Invest Blue. So we worked together at Templeton's Financial, where I sort of first started out my career as a financial planner. Probably 2 years into my stint there at Templeton's, he left to go to Invest Blue. And I thought, okay, well, wished him well, good luck. And didn't really hear from Tim for probably the best part of a year and a half or 2 years. And then one day out of the blue, I'm sort of minding my own business at Templeton's, and my phone starts ringing, and sure enough, it's Tim Jones. And I think, okay, well, pick up the phone, and he said, "There's an opportunity for you at Invest Blue." And I wasn't even looking for a job. One of those sort of, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Tim was the person. 20 minutes later, I was already at the Invest Blue office. I sat down with him. I sat down with Anthony as the regional manager. And long story short, I would say within a 3-week process, I had given my leave and I was already at Invest Blue, as you said, Mark, living my best life possible.
There you go, man. There you go. Well, we're stoked to be working with Invest Blue as Lumian, and even more stoked to be connected with you as part of our pilot. So at the time of recording, and for those that have sort of been keeping up through the AFR and what sort, Lumian and Invest Blue have been working together to build an ideal client experience platform for Invest Blue to deliver their best possible life Invest Blue way for their clients. And it's been amazing to work with people of Xander and the like to help us co-develop that. And Xander is joining us today because he's been one of the advocates of Lumiant in recent times, using this with his clients as part of the pilot group. But I specifically asked Xander on today because he's got some really fresh perspective from the lens of an advisor that's done it for their first time, really, and using Lumiant for their first time. Typically on Lumiant Live, we interview people that have sort of seasoned veterans, done it 5, 10, 15, 30 times and implemented it within their experience. But Xander, you're at the forefront or the bleeding edge of this, where you're part of the pilot group, trying it out for the first time after going through our Lumian Academy and having some weekly meetings with us to sort of discuss any challenges or feedback. So Xander has sort of taken the leap, and he's brought in 2 client stories for us today to explain how he's used it with a couple clients, and we'll spend some time unpacking how he did that and what it meant to him as a first-time advisor using Lumiant, so that we can sort of share that feeling, because we know that leap is sometimes really hard to sort of make. So Xander, with that sort of context, mate, how about you tell us about your first clients that you used Lumiant with, and a bit about their story, and then we can sort of unpack from there.
Yeah, so I felt like I was getting a little bit behind from I guess the cohort in using Lumiant. So I was getting a little bit stressed is probably how you could describe it initially, because you hear all these client stories and things are working really well for other advisors. It was sort of rolled out during end of financial year. I felt like I was getting behind, and I really wanted to use it. So I guess what was stopping me initially from using it is the fear of being, I guess, incompetent or being uncomfortable, which in hindsight was ridiculous, because it's just such a wonderful software and it's very easy to use. But I thought, okay, well, enough's enough. I've got to really throw myself in the deep end. You've got to start somewhere. So I picked a progress meeting, which for us as advisors is what we call a yearly review. And this was a client who, this was my first review with them. So the meeting 12 months ago was what we call an understand meeting, which is our first meeting with the client. And I think really what's quite ironic is an understand meeting, as the name suggests, is we should really understand what it is the clients want to achieve, what's important to them, what their values are. So then 12 months on, I have my first review meeting with them, and I decided to use Lumiant. And what I found is using it, this was basically the understand meeting that I never had. So 12 months ago, and I really came away from that meeting learning a little bit about them, their financial position, but from a value point of view, really just sort of touched the surface. And I'm obviously excited to get new clients, get them on board. But, reading my notes, I realized that from a values point of view, all I really knew is how much money they wanted to spend. I had a very basic retirement goal, which was David wanted to retire at a certain point, and you wanted to spend a certain amount of money each year. We sort of modeled that. Okay, is that feasible, whether it was 60 or 70 grand a year? But after using Lumion, I felt like I was really able to give meaning to that money. And we were able to really, work out the things that they wanted to do with each other, what was important to them. And I felt like Lumion was just able to help guide those conversations. Now, it's remarkably easy to use. Now, you send the links out, the Your Life survey, the Your Values survey. They completed it before the meeting. So I'm sitting there with the information. They both had values. I can read some of these out and I can share some stories, because the one that they both selected as their number one value was nurture relationships. And all I needed to do in the meeting was refer to the Lumion software. There it is, number one. And it's really just my job as an advisor just to ask this one really important question, which is, what does that mean to you, or why was that important? And then it's incredible how much information they're able to give you while you're just sitting there and taking notes. So I think that from a experience point of view, yeah, it works exceptionally well at understanding exactly what is important to the clients. And that puts us as an advisor in the best position possible to act in our clients' best interests.
Thank you, Xander. There's so much there that I want to deep dive into. I'm going to start with where you ended around the stories. Can you tell me a little bit about what you learned about when she was talking through her values and the stuff that she sort of mentioned?
So just to preface these stories, so in the Understand meeting, I would say David was definitely the one to do a lot of the talking. So David's the main breadwinner. So really the center was around, okay, well, when can he retire? And that was the focus. And I probably didn't give enough time in the spotlight to really work out what they wanted to achieve as a couple. So it was really good to allow to just have that, 5 or 10 minutes in the spotlight where she could really unpack these 5 values that were important to her. So her first value, which was nurture relationships. And I said to her, what does that actually mean to you? And she sort of turned to David and she really said, this is the person that means the most to me. And she sort of looked at me and said, Xander, the only way that I can answer this is by giving you an example. I said, perfect. She said that, back in the past, she could really recognize when it experiences stress, whether it was, work-related stress. And she said that in the past, she felt that she had the financial means to surprise with little trips away. And there's a nice little surprise holidays. She could take him away for a weekend, even for a week, get him out of Brisbane for that reset. And she said that, David not only appreciated that, but she got a lot of satisfaction out of being able to do that and having the financial means to do that. And David then turned to her and said, I couldn't agree with you more, because his number one value was nurture relationships too. And it links straight back to his wife. Being able, because he said that they're both able to recognize when one is feeling a certain way, but they've always felt like they couldn't react because they didn't have the financial means. So I thought that it's really good starting point just to realize how important they are to each other, and things as simple as little trips away mean the world to both of them. And then I turned to, and his second value was dedicating more time to those that I care about. And he said, well, that ties straight into nurture relationships really with my wife. And sort of interrupted and said, oh, I can share another story in relation to this. And she said that whenever she and David walk to the coffee shop, which is every Saturday morning and Sunday morning when it's not working, David supposedly says, I could do this every single morning for the rest of my life with you. And he was looking at, because this brings me all the joy in the world, but minus the work. So really understanding what each other meant to them and just how important the little things were to them, and being able to retire at a certain age and focus on these things, which I didn't even know about. I didn't even know about these things, 12 months ago. So I think that was really special, those two stories.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that, maybe in your understand meeting last year when you first met them, you focused a lot more on David than Anne. What did you notice of Anne's sort of demeanor in that meeting, now that she was sort of getting a voice or was involved? And also, as you answer it, Xander, maybe tell us a little bit about what you noticed around compared to when you met them 12 months ago and didn't go through this experience.
I think giving both of them the ability to talk about what's important to them is so important. I could see that was certainly more captivated. She was more engaged. It's knowing that her voice is being heard, and the things that she also wants to achieve are all, even though she's not the main breadwinner, she's actually not even working, but the things that they want to achieve as a couple are being, I guess, captured. Not only brought her joy, but I could see that it was also, he didn't interrupt once. He couldn't be happier just to sit back and see, speak about the things that matter to her. Perhaps even learn some new things about what's important to his wife. But it was really nice to see their five values and how much they overlapped with each other too. They're really on the same page with what they want to achieve as a couple.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned that you stuck a fair bit to the screens that Lumion provides you to ask the questions. Did
Yeah,
you
yeah.
did you feel the need, or were there any other questions or conversation points that you used to prompt them, or with the screens sort of doing it and they were sort of doing the heavy lifting? How did that work in practice?
Yeah, that was probably one of the areas that I sort of, while I was conducting my first Lumiere meeting, thinking, wow, this works so well, where I just ask, what does that mean to you? And is there anything else more important to that? And this sitting back and not saying boo, not interrupting, and just trying to capture everything that they say. How I did it was, yep, I had the value screen open in Lumion. What I find worked really well is that how our meeting rooms are set up at Invest Blue is the TV, which acts as our screen, the monitor is either to our left or to our right, depending on the meeting room. And my initial concern was that Lumion was going to be a distraction because everyone has to turn and you lose eye contact. But all I was doing was I was casting my laptop to the TV. So my laptop was still in front of me. So I could actually take the notes by touch typing and still maintain eye contact with both. And so I felt that helped me capture what they were saying while still being engaged and not having Lumion as this distraction where everyone has to swivel in their chair and look up at a screen. So yeah, and to answer your question, I just let Lumion and its questions guide me through the values-based conversation.
Yeah, awesome, man. I think I wouldn't underplay that sort of physical layout. I mean, kudos to you for thinking through that to make sure that the tech wasn't getting in the way of the personal connection. That's not to be underplayed. That we've spoken about that on the podcast before, and how you control the physical environment to get the experience that you desire, which is one of intimacy sometimes, right? So, mate, well
Yeah.
done for thinking through that, and thank you for sharing that tip. Before we move to the second customer, I wanted to pick up on some words you used really early in the piece, which was, when you were watching your pilot group members sort of go a little bit further ahead of you and you hadn't quite used it yet. And one of the things, or a couple of the things stopping you, was that you felt like you didn't want to show up and look incompetent, or sort of be in that uncomfortable environment. When you were in the meeting and actually, 2 feet into that values conversation, And it's okay if they did. Did those feelings arise again, or were you feeling something else? Tell me how you were feeling as a first-time user in that moment.
Yeah, so initially I was a little bit nervous. I thought, sometimes it's actually nice to feel nervous because you're out of your comfort zone. But yeah, I felt nervous, which is a good thing. Um, Nervous because it was something different. I was green. There's always that fear of looking incompetent and potentially losing a client. I think as advisors, we get judged really, and I'm sure all financial planning practices are very similar. Big KPIs as an advisor: client retention and bringing on new clients. So I thought, okay, well, to start off with, I'll do it on a client who I've already got. Um, and as I was doing it, that fear left so quickly because I realized that it's really Lumient that asks the questions. And it's my job just to capture all the wonderful things that the client is asking. And I think the way that advisors really add value, especially for retirees, is our modeling. So in this progress meeting, we have a requirement where we capture what the best life possible looks like for a client. That is what we need to model, because if we're not modeling a client's best life possible, then the modeling is meaningless. And realistically, we're not doing our job, because if the modeling isn't representative of the client's position today and what they want to achieve, then it could be creating a false sense of security for our clients. So what I learned off the back of using Lumient for the very first time, which I didn't know 12 months ago, was the fact that they wanted to live in a better house. I didn't even realize this 12 months ago. So they both had as a value, live in a better place. When I saw that, I thought, that's interesting. Can't wait to discuss it. I learned that they want to perform renovations ASAP. I learned how much they wanted to spend on carpet, shutters before downsizing. I learned about the reasons why they wanted to downsize. They have internal stairs. It's not their forever home. Then they said they wanted to protect the environment. We got talking about what's important to them in relation to their next home and the suburb that they want to live in. They were telling me about how important nature and wildlife is to them and living in a quiet suburb. So I learned so much about that. But really for my modeling, I learned that they wanted to sell. So they wanted to do the renovations. They wanted to sell within 12 months. I'm thinking that is a totally new goal. And so many strategies can fall off the back of that. So we get really excited as advisors when we've got strategies. Talking about other things. So I said, is there anything else more important than that? Then we've got talking about they need a new car. They want to do a European holiday one more time. And they told me about little trips around Australia that they want to do every year for the next 10 years. So I guess Lumient and the values-based conversation helped me immensely as an advisor capture the best life possible of my clients to then model exactly that. And if that model doesn't look good, then yes, at least we're discussing what it is they want to achieve, and we can address that and strategies to put them in the best position possible. So that's where it helped me the most, because modeling is so important. That's our value add. And if I don't know what the client wants to achieve, then our modeling is basically useless. So I owe all of that new information, I owe to Lumient.
Thank you, man. I mean, you got to still ask the questions, right? But I appreciate the sentiment. I love that. And for those that are watching the YouTube, or for those that are listening via our podcast, I'd urge you to watch the YouTube of this and see Xander's face light up and his arms go as he gets excited talking about his clients. Certainly puts a smile on my face, man, because that's ultimately what it's all about for us, right? So. Mate, thank you for sharing that. There's probably a couple other questions that I think we could unpack and knock off as we go through the next customer as well, more around sort of your journey as an advisor. But let's talk a little bit, or take that next shift into the next clients you've brought in, which were your first understand meeting clients. So just to reframe and clarify the language, as Xander mentioned before, for InvestBlue and Xander, understand is that first sort of discovery meeting where it's a new prospect client that you're sort of starting to get to know. So when we talk about the understand meeting, that's the meeting in question. So Xander, tell us a little bit about those clients and their story, and then we'll talk a bit about your sort of practice there.
Yeah, so understand meeting. So meeting this client for the very first time, I decided to use Lumient for the first time, or second time, but first time for an understand meeting. And client's name was, and in this particular case, I actually thought Lumient was working a little too well. When I brought up the values and what's important to him, it was remarkable just how much information he was able to provide to me about really his family situation and why protecting those that he cares about, spending without guilt is so important to him. So I sort of I probably didn't interrupt for maybe a full 10 minutes while he basically told me, and it was quite deep in terms of what his daughter and his son have gone through, and really tied that back as to why they are so important to him. He pays money into a mental health fund for his daughter. She went through some really tough times, but he gets immense satisfaction out of being able to put money towards her. She's now married with 2 kids. There was a stage where there was a very slimmer or small light at the end of the tunnel is probably the best way to describe it. So he really opened up about that, and I sort of just thanked him and really worked out some of his most critical goals, which were really to protect his family, and he's also the main carer for his wife, who unfortunately suffers ill health too. So a lot of his goals weren't really for himself. It was making sure that he could meet the needs of those around him. Very selfless individual. But he did say at the end that he wanted more brain time, as he called it. He spends a lot of his life giving to those that he cares about. But he said to me that he wants to make sure that there's enough in the slush fund, as he called it, to still have some time. Again, I don't think I could have ever had such deep conversations with my client unless it was really prompted through the values conversation through Lumient.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, and then I want to talk a little bit about. And so you mentioned this was the first time you've done it for an understand meeting. You mentioned earlier, it was quite a deliberate choice to do it with a client in a progress meeting because you knew them.
Yeah.
What was sort of the barrier for you, and how did you overcome it for clients with an understand meeting?
Yeah, that's a really easy question to answer. So again, KPIs, bringing new clients on, it's more difficult to bring on new clients than it is to keep existing clients. So I felt more secure and comfortable using it on an existing client, thinking even if I buggered it up, I shouldn't lose them unless I say something idiotic. But that wasn't the case. So I thought, okay, well that's the fear of really using it on a fresh lead or opportunity, as we call it, is the fear of not doing a good job and effectively converting that lead into a new client. But it's funny, in hindsight, this is probably what I would always say is anyone who feels green or uncomfortable, using Lumient and feeling uncomfortable and stuttering or just not doing it as best as you can will still deliver a better outcome than if you didn't do it and you just stuck to what you know, which was, okay, have your standard conversations, feel comfortable, and don't try anything new. Because I can tell you from firsthand that that feeling of being uncomfortable goes away very quickly and it works well. But yeah, that was the fear, not getting the client on board. Mark.
Hey, I get it, right? We hear that a bit. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's really raw and honest. And the reason we got you on, right? Because there'll be a plethora of advisors in a very similar space to you, wondering which client do they do it for the first time with. So You mentioned, the stuff that you learn will far outweigh how you feel and how uncomfortable you feel as an advisor. I can't help but think when you were listing all the things that were important to him, right? Putting money aside for mental health fund, protecting his family. He's the main carer for his wife, but he wants to make sure he's got time and so on. Yeah, I can't help but think and ask, was that what he initially reached out for, or what did he initially reach out for, and how did you get? Like, I know how you got to there with Lumion, but like, what did he think he was turning up to?
I spoke to him simply because he came across my desk as somebody who wanted to simply discuss his insurance, which he no longer wanted, and wanted to plan for his retirement. That was it. He was a product holder, which meant that I could see what he held from a super pension and insurance point of view. But in terms of what he actually wanted to achieve and all the values that were important to him, I knew none of that, and nor did I know that he was going to divulge all that. I think it was terrific to learn so much in such a short period of time.
Yeah, and then I mean that would be a pretty common. I'm going to use the word complex for people in a position like yourself, where the easy solve would be to solve his immediate problem, right? Reduce his insurance, cancel his insurance, maybe a needs analysis, a simple goal of reviewing his insurance and helping understand, what age he wants to retire and doing some modeling on that. Now, I know there's much more complexity to that, but you understand my sort of summary there. You could have just solved his immediate needs.
Yeah,
What made you make the jump to go, you know what, let's slow this down a little bit and understand his values and goals before we do that?
I just think that while I could have solved an immediate need, I think you build rapport and trust with anyone by getting to know them, and that's what they respect is really having those deep conversations. And I could see that he wanted to actually, speak about these things, because these are the things that matter to him. So, I think totally important to be able to do our job as best we can as an advisor, is to know our clients as best we can.
Yeah, that's really cool. You may still be in the advice process with him, so tell me if you are. But how has that conversation shaped your advice, or how will it shape your advice from the initial reason he reached out?
I guess in terms of measurable goals, there was a few things that I could model, because it really comes down to, okay, well, what are the strategies and products from a financial planning point of view that are then eligible based on those values discussions? And it was really making sure that there was an allowance for, the mental health fund that he contributes to his daughter, medical allowance for his wife, and also an allowance for the waiting time. So I think they, as simple as it sounds, knowing those three values and goals were really the crux of some of the five most important values that he discussed initially. So I think that the values through Lumion has really helped to set some clear goals for my clients.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, right? I reflect on my days checking SOAs back home in Australia, and that statement of advice could really have simply been, review insurance, review superannuation, retire at age X with X dollars in the bank. But you've now got, potentially those things still there, but ensure allocation for mental health fund for daughter, ensure family is protected, ensure there's a health allowance as he's the main carer for the wife, and ensure there's money set aside for time. How much more personalized and transformational is that experience compared to the former?
And I think it's so important, because I've been guilty, and I've read a lot of statements of advice from previous planners, and a lot of advisors, even at Invest Blue, we're not perfect, are guilty of just having that very vanilla. Okay, well, you want to retire at 65 on 80 grand a year. Okay, perfect. Let's see if that's feasible. but you don't actually know what that money means to them, what they're trying to achieve with it, their values and goals. So it's really giving meaning to the money. And certainly, I think they walk away with a lot more satisfaction as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, I agree. So, man, one question I wanted to ask. You've sort of alluded to it a couple times, and it was more around, for lack of a better term, your tenure and experience. And
Yeah.
and let me clarify that a little bit. So, 7 years into financial advice, 3 years at Invest Blue. People that I've interviewed on this before have typically had, considerable experience. I mean, I'm only 13 years in the industry myself. So, and 6 of those on the banking side of things. So,
Yeah.
I'm still learning through listening. You're still learning through doing. Can you tell me a little bit about your reflection based on the skills that you came into financial planning learning and being trained on, compared to what maybe Lumient might have done for you, whether it's through the academy or the technology itself, to
Yeah. Yeah.
enhance or adopt or sort of augment those skills?
Yes, I think my skill set is coming from an engineering background. I'd rate myself with numbers. So from a technical financial planning point of view, I'd like to think that I know the legislation and I know the numbers well. So probably where I was lacking was really uncovering, all the things that my client wanted to achieve, because it's no good just having this immense knowledge base if you can't then apply it, because you're applying it in terms of strategies and products to help a client solve their goals if you don't know what those goals are. So it's really coming back to everything that we do being values-based or goals-based advice. Is the client is at the center of everything that we do. So if you are coming into the financial advice industry thinking that you know the MLC Facts and Figures book inside out, and it's pretty incredible if you do. Like, I've got it on my desk. I reckon I've had that book, which is basically every number that you need to know as an advisor. I've had it on my desk since day dot. So I like to think that, that's probably the area that I would rate myself in. But probably where I lacked was really, getting to know the client's value proposition to then be able to apply, that knowledge base through strategies and products. So I think that, my downfall, or the area as an advisor where I need to improve, has been improved through Lumient, which has really helped.
Thank you for sharing that, man. I think that's something that we hold really dear. We know that that's where the traditional training and advice sort of lies, and for obvious reason, right? You need to be technically proficient. We'll never argue that, but we certainly share that sentiment, and it's sort of what's on our mind as we support people through having these conversations, that we need to provide that content to support you and help you feel empowered. So thank you for sharing that, Xander. Mate, I think this has been an excellent conversation from the perspective of someone that's leapt into their first couple meetings. And, the emotional turmoil, for lack of a better term, that you had to go through yourself internally before you even gave it to your clients. And then how you sort of buckled up and went along for the ride with both examples. So I'll summarize some of those things in a moment. But before we do, like we do with all our Lumient users that come on as guests of the podcast, I'd love to bug you for one extra tip that you would give to a peer. It might be a peer that's relatively new in the industry, or typically the tip is for people that are thinking about embedding this into their experience. From your perspective, Xander, if you were speaking directly to those people on our podcast, what tip might you give them?
I would say, if you can't answer the simple question, which is what's important to your clients, what do they want to achieve, when do they want to achieve them, if they can't answer any of those, important why questions, then perhaps they're not having the values-based conversation sufficiently enough, and perhaps they would benefit from Lumion. So, look, if there's an advisor out there who knows their clients inside out because they've had a 10-year or 15, 20-year working relation, then okay, that's fine. But I think anyone out there who can't answer some of those important why questions, which I think are so important, will benefit from Lumion. And top tip, I think, don't feel like you need to be perfect. Throw yourself. All I did in the end was I watched one training video, which was an example of another advisor here in Invest Blue doing it with a colleague. He does it well. He actually had a script, but I don't think that you need a script per se, because you let Lumion guide the conversations, no different to some of the conversations you don't normally have with a client. But don't feel like you have to be perfect. And I truly believe that by using it and not being perfect, you will still have a better client experience. They will prefer it because you're asking all the questions that are important to them. You'll learn so much more. And I think in turn, your client retention will look better and you'll bring on more clients. Because it just shows that you care, put it that way. And look, even if you're capturing a lot of value information, of which some might be measurable goals, clients still like to talk about all the things that are important to them, their family, their children, etc. So just because you can't model some goals doesn't mean that this information isn't important. Believe me, to the client it is. They want to talk about it. So number one tip, don't be afraid to fail and don't feel like you have to be perfect. It's a pretty easy software to use.
Xander, mate, that's excellent. Look, you've shared with us a couple client stories today from a progress meeting, someone that you met first a year ago, and you had the understand meeting you wish you had. It was your terms in the progress meeting. And then all the way to the front end of the experience. So someone you hadn't met yet, taking them through their first understand meeting. And you walked us through the immense impact and breadth of information that you got through diving headfirst into that experience and understanding their values. Mate, where you ended there is probably what I would sum up your sort of theme in this episode, which is really getting comfortable being uncomfortable and embracing that imperfection is such a really cool message for our audience, and in particular those trying Lumion or a values-based experience for the first time and maybe have that fear of sort of being found out or being uncomfortable. So Xander, on behalf of the entire Invest Blue audience who I know will be tuning into this and the Lumion Live audience, mate, thank you so much for sharing so honestly, your message. It's really, really appreciated, man.
No, my absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Lumion Live. If you really enjoyed it, we'd love if you could hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming episodes. Thanks again for tuning in.